The Bradford restaurant stood like a crown jewel in the heart of Aspen Falls, its rooftop terrace crowned with the city's glittering skyline. Inside, the opulent dining hall pulsed with an electric energy. Candles flickered in their holders, casting golden hues across polished silverware and pristine table linens. Each guest was a study in perfection, men in tailored Armani suits, women draped in silk and satin, their jewels catching the light like stars scattered across the velvet night. At the center of it all sat Graham Ashworth, the city's most celebrated tycoon, a man whose wealth and influence had made him a legend among his peers. Beside him, his pregnant wife, Patricia, radiated maternal beauty, her white gown flowing elegantly around her swelling belly. But amidst this sea of sophistication, a storm brewed. Veronica Hale, Graham's mistress, rose from her seat with calculated grace. Her crimson gown shimmered under the soft candlelight, a stark contrast to the pure whiteness of Patricia's dress. As she lifted her crystal flute, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a languid motion, she tipped the glass, sending a cascade of deep burgundy wine spilling onto Patricia's pristine gown. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave crashing against the shore. Patricia's eyes widened in horror as the stain bloomed across her gown, her hand instinctively clutching her belly. Graham, instead of intervening, erupted into laughter, a cruel, self-satisfied sound that echoed through the room. His amusement at his wife's public humiliation was palpable, as if he viewed the spectacle as a triumph rather than a tragedy. Veronica, with a smug grin, stepped forward and kissed his hand, a gesture that seemed to mock Patricia entirely. The act was not just a betrayal. It was a public execution, a display of power and disdain that left the guests stunned. For the first time, the illusion of Graham's charm and control cracked. The laughter that followed was not joy but a collective shudder of disgust. Whispers spread like wildfire through the dining hall, each one more damning than the last. Even the waitstaff paused mid-step, their faces pale with disbelief. Among them, Judge Samuel Bateman, Patricia's father, sat rigid in his seat, his expression a mix of fury and despair. He had seen too many injustices in his career, but this was personal. His daughter, his granddaughter-to-be, stood humiliated before the world, and Graham, the man he once respected, reveled in it. The evening, which had begun as a celebration of wealth and status, had become a grotesque farce. The laughter of the guests now felt hollow, their applause forced. The opulence of the setting only highlighted the moral decay beneath the surface. Veronica, emboldened by Graham's approval, had crossed a line that could not be unseen. For Graham, the act was more than a mere dalliance. It was a declaration of power, a statement that he could do as he pleased without consequence. But for Patricia, it was a breaking point. Her dignity, her sense of safety, and her trust in her husband had been shattered in one devastating moment. The ripple effect of that night was immediate and far-reaching. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire through Aspen Falls, fueling gossip columns and social media feeds. Patricia withdrew from public view, retreating to the safety of a friend's estate, where she hoped to shield herself from the relentless glare of the press. Graham, however, continued to attend high-profile events, his arrogance unwavering. But behind the scenes, cracks began to appear. Anonymous threats reached his office, his home, and even Veronica's penthouse, each message laced with cryptic warnings about secrets from his past. The evening at Bradford was not just a moment of betrayal. It was the spark that ignited a chain reaction of consequences. What seemed like a harmless affair had unraveled into a web of blackmail, deceit, and legal repercussions. And as the days passed, the laughter that once filled the room would soon be replaced by the echo of justice being served. The night at the Bradford had been a spectacle of betrayal and humiliation, but its impact was far from over. As the clock struck midnight, Patricia retreated into the sanctuary of Lucinda Morgan's estate, a place she had shared countless memories with her dear friend since their college days. The sprawling mansion, nestled on the outskirts of Aspen Falls, was a fortress against the relentless media circus that had already begun to descend upon her. Yet, even here, she couldn't escape the prying eyes and ears of the world. Reporters camped outside her gates, their cameras clicking incessantly, their microphones thrust towards her windows like weapons. Patricia felt suffocated, her world shrinking under the weight of public scrutiny. Each knock on the door was a reminder of the shame that had been heaped upon her, and each flash of a camera felt like another wound to her fragile psyche. Meanwhile, Graham, the man who had orchestrated this humiliation, seemed unfazed by the scandal. At least that's what the world saw. Underneath the polished surface, cracks were forming. The confident tycoon who once dominated every room he entered now faced threats that haunted his nights. Anonymous messages arrived daily, each more menacing than the last. They spoke of secrets buried deep in his past, secrets that could unravel everything he had built. These weren't just idle warnings, they were laced with a chilling promise of retribution. Graham, who had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, now found himself powerless against forces he couldn't identify. His once immaculate office became a battleground of paranoia. Every knock at his door made him flinch. Every unfamiliar car parked outside his penthouse sent his pulse racing. The laughter that had once filled his parties was replaced by the oppressive silence of dread. Even his closest associates began to distance themselves, their loyalty tested by the scandal. The walls of his world, once so sturdy, were crumbling, and Graham was left standing in the rubble, exposed and vulnerable. Patricia, on the other hand, was drowning in her own despair. The pregnancy, already strained by the stress of Graham's behavior, now bore the added burden of public judgment. Each contraction, each flutter of movement from her unborn child reminded her of the life growing within her and the man who had placed it in jeopardy. She tried to shield herself from the relentless media frenzy, but the fear of what might happen next gnawed at her. The threats she had received were vague but terrifying, their implications clear. Graham's enemies were watching her, waiting for her to make a move. The isolation she sought was a double-edged sword. While it protected her from the public eye, it also isolated her from the support she desperately needed. Her phone remained silent, save for the occasional call from reporters or the occasional text from Lucinda, who tried to keep her spirits up. But even Lucinda's reassurances couldn't ease the suffocating pressure Patricia felt. The scandal had stripped her of her dignity and her privacy, leaving her raw and exposed. Back at the corporate headquarters of Ashworth Industries, the atmosphere was equally tense. Deals that once flowed effortlessly now stalled, as partners and clients grew wary of associating with Graham. The boardroom, once a bastion of power, now echoed with whispers of doubt and uncertainty. Graham's attempts to maintain his composure were met with increasing resistance. 2 employees had already been dismissed for asking too many questions about the suspicious wire transfers that had surfaced. Graham's legal team scrambled to contain the damage, but the DA's office was breathing down their necks. Subpoenas demanded access to financial records stretching back 18 months, and the threat of criminal charges loomed larger with each passing day. Graham's confidence, once unshakable, now wavered under the weight of mounting evidence. The tycoon who had once ruled the city with an iron fist was now fighting for survival, his empire teetering on the brink of collapse. The tension between Graham and those closest to him reached a boiling point when Judge Samuel Bateman, Patricia's father, intervened. A retired jurist with a reputation for dismantling corruption, he couldn't ignore the possibility that his son-in-law was involved in illegal activities. Arranging a meeting with Graham at a neutral location, he delivered a blunt ultimatum: stop threatening Patricia or face the full force of the law. Graham, furious at being called out in such a public manner, left the meeting seething with anger. The battle lines were drawn, and the war that followed would shake Aspen Falls to its core. The opulent facade of Graham Ashworth's empire hid a darker reality. Behind the glittering soirees and imposing office buildings lay a labyrinth of deceit and corruption. Graham, once revered as a titan of industry, was now embroiled in a web of financial crimes that stretched back years. The evidence was mounting against him, and his world was crumbling faster than he could comprehend. Anonymous letters arrived daily at his office, their cryptic messages dripping with malice. "We know what you've done," they whispered. "The past isn't as buried as you think." Each letter was a dagger to his ego, a reminder that his meticulously crafted image was a lie. The threats weren't just idle words. They hinted at exposure, at the destruction of everything he had built. At home, the tension was palpable. Graham's penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a prison. The quiet evenings he used to enjoy were replaced by sleepless nights, his mind racing with possibilities. Who was behind the letters? How far did they know? The paranoia consumed him, driving him to take drastic measures. He hired a private security firm, hoping to uncover the source of the threats. But the firm's findings were inconclusive, only adding to his unease. The walls of his penthouse became his sanctuary, yet they felt suffocating. The man who had once commanded respect now found himself cornered, his every move scrutinized. Then came the arrival of Raymond Stark, a private investigator with a reputation for uncovering the darkest secrets. Stark materialized like a specter, delivering a small USB drive to Graham's office. The drive contained damning evidence of his illegal activities, bank transfers, shell companies, and forged documents. Graham's breath caught as he scrolled through the files, each entry a brick in the wall that would crush him. The USB wasn't just evidence. It was a ticking bomb, poised to explode at any moment. Stark's visit wasn't coincidental. It was a calculated strike aimed at destroying Graham's carefully constructed facade. The investigator's cold demeanor and sharp gaze left no doubt that he would stop at nothing to expose the truth. Graham's world spiraled further out of control when the district attorney's office issued subpoenas for his financial records. The demands covered a staggering 18 months, leaving no stone unturned. His attorneys scrambled to stall the investigation, but the sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming. Graham's associates began to distance themselves, their loyalty eroded by the scandal. The once impenetrable Ashworth Industries now resembled a house of cards, ready to collapse under the slightest pressure. Graham's arrogance, once his greatest asset, became his undoing. He found himself surrounded by enemies, both real and imagined, each one more determined than the last to bring him down. The stakes were raised even higher when Detective Julian Reyes entered the picture. Reyes, a man of quiet intensity, had been quietly gathering evidence against Graham for months. His sources confirmed that the USB drive was only the tip of the iceberg. The investigator had footage of a meeting between Stark and Veronica Hale, implicating Graham in a vast conspiracy. The audio was incomplete, but it was enough to create reasonable doubt. Reyes' presence was a harbinger of doom, a reminder that Graham's days of impunity were numbered. Patricia, caught in the crossfire, watched her husband's descent with growing dread. The man she had once loved was unraveling before her eyes, consumed by greed and paranoia. The threats against her and the baby weighed heavily on her mind, each one a reminder of the dangers she faced. She confided in her father, Judge Samuel Bateman, who promised to protect her. But even his influence couldn't shield her from the fallout. The scandal had permeated every aspect of her life, leaving her isolated and vulnerable. Graham's attempts to salvage his reputation were futile. The media had a field day, dissecting every detail of his downfall. Headlines screamed of his involvement in money laundering and fraud, painting him as a villain in the public eye. The once mighty tycoon found himself reduced to a caricature, his image shredded by the relentless scrutiny. The trial loomed large, a public spectacle that would determine his fate. Graham's legal team fought valiantly, but the evidence against him was insurmountable. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of a man who had sacrificed morality for profit, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. The USB drive, once a weapon in Stark's arsenal, became the linchpin of the prosecution's case. Its contents were irrefutable, a digital smoking gun. Graham's legal team tried to discredit the evidence, but the jury remained unconvinced. The trial was a public crucible, a forum for justice to prevail. Graham, who had once believed himself untouchable, now faced the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was a battlefield where his reputation and freedom were on the line. The rainy encounter at the abandoned train yard. The storm that had been brewing over Aspen Falls finally broke one night, drenching the city streets in sheets of rain. Veronica Hale, cloaked in a long coat against the biting wind, stepped out of her chauffeur-driven car and approached the abandoned train yard on the southern outskirts of the city. The site, once a hub of bustling activity, now stood as a ghostly relic of the past. Its rusted tracks and dilapidated boxcars whispering secrets of forgotten times. Raymond Stark, the private investigator known for his ruthless efficiency, awaited her in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. His angular face was partially illuminated by the orange haze of a cigarette, its smoke curling into the cold air. He exhaled slowly, his voice low and deliberate. "You're late," he said, his tone laced with impatience. Veronica squared her jaw, her defiance evident even in the dim light. "Cut the theatrics," she snapped. "What do you want?" Stark dropped the cigarette to the ground, crushing it underfoot with a decisive motion. "I was on Graham's payroll to gather information on certain rivals," he began, his eyes locking onto hers. "But I discovered more than I bargained for." A chill ran down Veronica's spine as she processed his words. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. Stark reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive, holding it aloft like a trophy. "This," he said, his grin crooked. "It's got files, bank transactions, passports, shipments. Let's just say your precious Graham might be involved in laundering money for some very unsavory people." Veronica's breath hitched. She knew Graham was shady, but actual criminal activity on that scale, it was enough to destroy him and possibly send him to prison. The thought of losing her connection to such wealth and influence sent a wave of panic through her. "Let me guess," she said, folding her arms defensively. "You want me to pay you to keep it hidden?" Stark chuckled, a cold, calculating sound. "Consider it an opportunity. I'm letting you get ahead of the storm. Meet me here tomorrow night at 10, and we'll discuss how to handle this." Before Veronica could reply, Stark hung up, leaving her staring at her phone in horror. Her mind raced. Stark had once rummaged through Graham's personal files under the guise of investigating a competitor. He likely had access to secrets that could ruin Graham or land him in prison. The stakes were impossibly high, and Veronica realized she was stepping into treacherous territory. If Graham found out she was involved in any way, he'd abandon her, or worse, turn on her. Yet she couldn't deny the pull of ambition. Her entire life had been built on carefully orchestrated moves, from small manipulations to playing men against each other. Could she really walk away from this? The flash drive represented power, leverage, and potentially a bigger piece of Graham's fortune. But as she pondered her options, A silent observer perched behind a dilapidated boxcar filmed their entire conversation. Detective Julian Reyes, tipped off about the meeting, had been monitoring it from afar. The tangled web of Graham Ashworth's personal fiasco was finally yielding tangible leads for a criminal investigation. The next day, Veronica mulled over her decision. Her connections in high society might be able to help suppress the scandal, but they were reluctant to involve themselves in federal crimes. If she refused Stark's demands, he might leak the information to the authorities, Patricia or Judge Bateman. The thought of the scandal exploding was unbearable. Finally, she resolved to meet Stark again, determined to find out what he had on her and on Graham. The trial. Justice in the spotlight. 3 weeks of national attention unfolded in the grand marble courthouse of Aspen Falls. The trial of Graham Ashworth was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle that captivated the nation. Cameras buzzed outside the courthouse steps, reporters jockeying for position as spectators lined up for seats inside. The air was thick with anticipation, every detail scrutinized by the public and dissected by national news channels. At the center of this whirlwind stood Graham Ashworth, the man who had once ruled Aspen Falls with an iron fist, now flanked by his defense attorneys in dark navy suits. His arrogance, which had once been unshakable, now faltered under the weight of evidence and the scrutiny of a nation. Veronica Hale, the mistress who had poured wine on Patricia's gown, emerged as a pivotal witness for the prosecution. Her testimony was a devastating blow to Graham's defense. Dressed modestly in a tailored gray suit, she recounted the humiliating dinner at the Bradford with steely resolve. When asked about her actions that night, she admitted to feeling pressured and confused, but emphasized that she had never intended to harm Patricia physically. Her demeanor, though regretful, revealed a complex web of manipulation by Graham. The prosecutor skillfully illustrated Graham's role in orchestrating her actions, using bank transfers and emails to connect the dots. Veronica's revelation that she had been blackmailed with stolen files added layers of complexity to the case, showing Graham's ruthlessness extended beyond his immediate circle. Detective Julian Reyes took the stand next, delivering a methodical account of his investigation. His meticulous approach and impeccable record left little room for doubt. The partial audio recording of Veronica and Stark discussing hush money further corroborated the prosecution's claims. The defense attempted to undermine Reyes' credibility, but his steadfast demeanor and the sheer volume of evidence overwhelmed their objections. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as jurors exchanged skeptical glances. The financial documents provided by Veronica and Reyes were damning, detailing Graham's involvement in money laundering, bribery, and intimidation. Each document was like a brick in the wall that would ultimately seal Graham's fate. Patricia Ashworth's testimony was the emotional crescendo of the trial. Sitting beside her father, Judge Samuel Bateman, she faced the man who had once been her husband. Her pregnancy was more pronounced now, her face drawn with exhaustion but also determination. Under direct questioning, she described a marriage marked by distance and fear. Graham's erratic behavior, late-night phone calls, and midnight deliveries had left her feeling unsafe. She recounted the night at the Bradford with a mixture of grief and resolve. "He laughed while his mistress humiliated me," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "He never apologized." The defense attempted to portray her as a scorned wife seeking revenge, but Patricia stood firm, guided by her father's counsel. Her measured responses and factual recounting of incidents impressed many in the courtroom. The jury seemed sympathetic, their faces reflecting a growing belief in her account. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Graham watched Patricia intently, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he might break down under the weight of his own actions. His once confident facade crumbled under the avalanche of evidence. The trial was not just about money. It was about the moral downfall of a powerful figure. The public devoured every detail, their imaginations stirred by the spectacle of a man brought low by his own greed and callousness. Patricia's measured testimony, combined with the financial evidence, deepened the hole Graham was already in. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of a man who, behind his veneer of wealth and glamour, had orchestrated a sprawling scheme to hide illicit funds, bribe officials, and intimidate anyone who stood in his way. On the final day of the trial, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy to commit money laundering, fraud, and intimidation. The announcement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Graham, who had once been untouchable, now faced the consequences of his actions. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously. Outside, the crowd surged forward, cameras flashing as Graham was led out in handcuffs. For Patricia, it was a moment of both vindication and sorrow. Seeing the father of her unborn child in that position was painful, but she felt a sense of justice finally being served. Judge Bateman laid a supportive hand on her shoulder, offering silent comfort. Veronica Hale, indicted as a conspirator, had negotiated a deal that required her to serve community service and pay heavy fines, but avoided jail time in exchange for her cooperation. Her reputation as the mistress who had poured wine on a pregnant wife was irreparably damaged, her social ambitions in tatters. Detective Julian Reyes received a commendation for his perseverance in investigating the Ashworth case, his career forever shaped by the lessons learned from this ordeal. The fallout, a new beginning amidst ruins. As the final gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, Graham Ashworth stood defeated, his empire crumbling around him. The once dazzling millionaire, who had ruled Aspen Falls with an iron fist, now faced the consequences of his actions. Convicted on multiple counts of money laundering, fraud, and intimidation, Graham was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The verdict was a thunderclap of justice, a culmination of months of relentless investigation and courtroom drama. The man who had reveled in wealth and influence now found himself shackled by the very laws he had once exploited. His fall from grace was swift and absolute, a public spectacle that left many in Aspen Falls stunned. The tycoon who had once been untouchable now stood stripped of everything he valued, his reputation, his freedom, and his legacy. Veronica Hale, the woman whose actions had sparked the scandal, narrowly escaped imprisonment. However, her escape came at a steep cost. Her reputation, once a valuable asset, was now a liability. The socialite who had dreamed of ascending Aspen Falls elite circles found herself ostracized. Her name became synonymous with betrayal, and her attempt to cultivate a new persona was met with derision. Social invitations dried up, and her once thriving social media presence dwindled to a trickle. Realizing she could no longer endure the whispers and judgment, Veronica made the difficult decision to leave Aspen Falls. Packing her belongings, she disappeared into the anonymity of a foreign city, hoping to start anew. Though she avoided jail, her life had been irrevocably altered. The glittering dreams of wealth and power she had chased were now ashes, and the woman who had once been the mistress of scandal found herself adrift, searching for a purpose in a world that no longer welcomed her. Patricia Ashworth, on the other hand, embraced her newfound freedom with quiet resolve. The pregnancy, once a source of fear and uncertainty, now marked the beginning of a brighter future. Holding her newborn son, Samuel Graham Ashworth, in her arms, she felt a surge of hope and determination. Named in part to honor her father, the boy carried within him the promise of a life unburdened by the sins of his father. Patricia and her father established a trust fund to ensure the child's future, shielding him from the tainted legacy of Graham's fortune. Together, they created a nurturing environment filled with love and stability, where the scars of the past could heal. Though the public eye still lingered, Patricia was determined to build a life where her child could thrive, free from the shadow of scandal. The trial had been a grueling ordeal, but it had also taught her resilience and strength she never knew she possessed. Outside the courtroom, Graham's world imploded. His once impressive corporate headquarters stood empty, its assets seized by the state. His friends and associates distanced themselves, leaving him alone in his final moments of freedom. The irony was not lost on him. The man who had reveled in control now found himself utterly powerless. As he was led away in handcuffs, the irony of his situation struck him with brutal clarity. The laughter that had once echoed through his lavish parties now felt hollow, a distant memory of a life he could no longer reclaim. The courtroom had stripped him bare, exposing the emptiness beneath his wealth and ambition.